I'm very happy to introduce our speakers, Jan Höper and Cecilie Harr Moen from UiT, the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. Cecilia brings many different experiences, from working as a nature guide in tourism to teaching adults in Svalbard and Greenland. Her research explores play and learning in natural environments, indigenous perspective in recreation, and sustainability in physical and outdoor learning. Currently, she works as a university lecturer in outdoor and physical education. And Jan is with her. He's a senior lecturer in science education with a background as a biologist, chemistry and science teacher, and also as a museum educator. His research focuses on species knowledge, outdoor education, and ways of integrating chemistry and Sámi perspectives in outdoor learning. So I'm sure even from this, they will bring us many interesting examples and ideas. And with that, Jan and Cecilia, the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting us, Emma. That was so nice. Suddenly this contact popped up in our mailbox, and won't you be happy to tell us something about the Scandinavian mountains, because we are very interested. So we hope we have found some interesting points, a lot of pictures from our area where we live. And as we understand, you are all educators in some way, adult educators, teacher educators, and so on, organizers. So we have tried to have a level of not too much into detail, science or physical education, but on an understandable level. So that's interesting for everybody who's walking in the nature and trying to experience it. So I think I will share our slides. So then I might remove you from this presentation, so we can have you. Yes, okay. Now, we just had to find a title, and we were fully free to do whatever we want, as Emma said. So we thought, yeah, where is the glacier? As you mentioned, the glaciers are retreating, they're melting a lot. So let's just explore how our landscape looks and if we actually find a glacier today. Therefore, we thought our plan for today, or our 6 chapters, if you want to say it this way, that we are just shortly introducing our area so that you have an idea on where we sit now. Then we will try to walk to a glacier, take you on a hike, and see some phenomena on the side which we meet, which might be interesting for you, as our bedrock, our rocks in total here are quite different from the Alps. And I only have been once in Slovenia, so in Strunjan at the coast. So everything was calcareous, limestone, and cast. Very interesting, but totally different from what we have. So maybe it's you find some nice rocks here to maybe visit us someday. So then Cecilie will go on to take a more theoretical perspective. And what people always surprise, are we actually allowed to just walk wherever we want to in Norway? Yes, something like that. Something about the skills we need if we walk on one of the glaciers. And when we come down from the glacier again at the way back to the parking lot, we will look a little bit on the plants on our way, because it's a fascinating thing. If the glacier retreats, the new plants can develop. And if there is time and interest, we can also talk a little bit about the research we undertake towards outdoor education. Some new results that are quite interesting, I think. So, Cecilie, do you want to say something about what we thought of today?
There is a mixture of interdisciplinary thinking and working from me and Jan, because we work together, but we also work quite on both our sides with different classes and different perspectives into the education. But with so the aim of learning in glacier environments, what we figure we would talk about, like the enabling teacher students to understand and meaningfully facilitate everyday phenomena in their local, regional, outdoor environments. And when we say local and regional, it's because, of course, we don't have the glacier next to our university. We have to like move ourselves not so far, but we could say it's a regional perspective.
Yeah, I can show it in a few minutes.
Also, we work quite a lot with developing a place-based education related to all aspects of education. That was like the main goal when we started to work with students in glaciers, because the story we will tell today is from different excursions, not only one, but it's from the same area, from the same glacier, like our example glacier, I would say. And then, of course, we find this framework, the European framework for Green Comp, very interesting, how they pronounce sentences, which really talks to the way we make education here in Norway too. So this is directly from their framework, like to reflect on personal values, identify and explain how values vary among people and over time, while critically evaluating how they align with sustainability values. This is like a huge goal to investigate in our teaching. But yeah, welcome to Tromsø. We need a little introduction of where we are. This is like a picture, overview picture of the island we are sitting on right now. We are in Tromsø, in a small island surrounded by mountains, fjords, and rivers. We are a little bit north on the island here. You will see on the right side of the picture would be north, and on the left side of the picture would be south. So the island is very much north, south, east, west. This is a dark season picture, so you can barely see the mountains in the west over there. But it seems like there's no green lungs at all on this island. That's, I guess, because of the lights. It's pretty much one ski track who goes 10 kilometers from the north to the south of this island. So the university is placed a little bit north of the center of this island. So there is the highest point is only 180 meters above sea level, with a small water on the top of the island, a little lake, and there's about 40,000 people living in this little island. So in the community all around, there's about 80,000 people.
Yeah, but should we show where we are, so you have an idea how far north we are? Because we are actually, let's see, I can, why can't I not? We are up here, if you see, to the, not the highest point in Norway, but we are like 300 kilometers above the polar circle, and Slovenia isn't even on this map. So it's quite a way to Central Europe from us.
69 degrees of north, yeah. So, but despite of that, we are in a very coastal climate area. So we're close to the inland. So we have in 1 to 2 hours we will reach no snow, and we will reach a lot of snow. We will reach almost the driest point in Norway. It will be only 1 hour drive east of us. So there's like very much microclimates in close to Tromsø, so you can explore very much different vegetation and very much variation in both, very much diversity, yes. I would say.
But then also, I think maybe some of you have heard of Tromsø in the last years, because it's now always called like either the Paris of the North or the capital of
I would say we have maybe gone from being the capital of like polar expeditions and fishing and trapping, and we're moving on to something else. So like Tromsø it's now officially like the Arctic capital of Norway, or the capital of the Arctic. We are in the subarctic areas, but still we are rated in like the Arctic landscapes. Yeah. So which means that there was this really easy access to the polar region. So polar expeditions during the 1800s were very much likely to start here. both locally and internationally, because there is quite a easy accessible harbor. So the town here has quite a lot of history of fishing and trappers and polar expedition. And also we had this university is actually 58 years old already. So now the university and the hospital is pretty much, and of course the tourism is pretty much the baseline for working.
Yeah, because what happened some years ago was that BBC was showing a film about the Northern Lights in Tromsø, and what we now see is an explosion in tourism, travel directly from all over Central Europe, from Asia and other parts of the world, and now it looks like this in the winter. Everybody wants to see the Northern Lights, the reindeer.
Yeah, and it's a tame reindeer. You see that we have like close to our island. There's two families two Sámi families who's running the reindeer business. Maybe not as traditionally as before, but they try as far as you can do traditionally reindeer herding close to a big city. But it's still quite possible. So yeah, we might continuing from the trapper and fishing villages to the. I saw just an overview yesterday. There is today less than 2,000 fishermen left in Tromsø, unfortunately. So the fishing industry is moving away from the city center. If you go back a little bit, Jan. So the centered picture here is from downtown, the harbor, and the left picture is from, you might think that tourism is a new phenomenon, but actually there was tourism here very early, even in the 1700s. There was quite a lot of tourists coming for the only rich tourists, of course, coming with ships. So this picture is just an example of trappers who brought polar bear cubs actually from Svalbard. So they might, that was before the polar bear were protected. It was protected in 1974. But before that, you could actually bring polar bear cubs to Tromsø, and they were pretty often sold further to European zoos. Luckily, the polar bear got protected in 1974, but this was one of the pictures I found actually from the trappers bringing two polar bear cubs to Tromsø in the 60s. Yeah, so that was a little background.
Yeah, but as we said, we are both very keen on outdoor education, as you are as well. So we should maybe leave the city after a while. So you had some thoughts about showing how the landscape around may see.
Yeah,
like.
This picture is taken by my husband last winter. So it shows us what you access if you drive 30, 40 minutes away from Tromsø. This is like a half an hour drive. It shows us also the highest mountain in the Lyngen Peninsula, which is, you might have heard of the Lyngen Peninsula. That's where we find most of the glaciers nearby. And if you see a little bit left, just directly under the 1834 meter above sea level, you will see that this was like the first day the sun came back. So we had like a slice of sun rays on the highest mountain in the region, which is Jekkivarri. And this is the highest mountain peak we do have with the huge glacier on the top. So it's possible. It's not a manipulated photo, so the light is pretty much authentic, I would say.
Yeah, because that's one consequence of being above the polar circle. We have 2 months without sun, and then it comes back after 2 months, and it's a happy day for everybody here to see the first sunshine again. And then in the summer we have 24/7 sun. So now you put us directly in this landscape, but maybe I don't actually see a glacier here. These are just tops. So if we want to hike to a glacier, we should just continue. But before we do that, we just wanted to have a little bit feedback so we can just try to adjust a little bit what your motivation is here today, because we saw in the first chat that you already said, oh, Scandinavia is good already, but it might be a little bit more specific. What are you expecting from us? Why are you motivated to be here? we will see if this functions technically. You just take a picture with of the QR code with your mobile phone, and then I see one participant is typing already. We'll see what pops up here. It's anonymous, so don't be shy. Two very good motivations. Yeah. Oh, very nice, yes. The Nordic view of outdoor learning, which we call Uteskole, often also in English. I've never been to a glacier, very good. And see different places. I think we come into all of these aspects.
Pure nature, yeah.
Yeah.
We hope to keep the pure nature in the future. That's one of our really, what
Nice
could you
picture.
say?
Okay, we hopefully come into most of your aspects here. Critically evaluate our approach to adult education. Wow, that's cool.
Yeah,
you come into this.
Yesterday we the local communities are a little bit like, we also love the tourism, we love people coming here, we love the pure nature, and we love to share it. And then we have these like really issues of over tourism starting to affect us very much. So yesterday it was actually launched a crushing report in this region where it shows yellow and red lights in all parameters of sustainable tourism for a place. So it's a very critically time, I think, for the politicians to highlight how to how to critically evaluate how we are working in this town. Yeah.
Yeah, very nice. I miss snow. Yeah, we also miss snow this winter. It's already nearly gone in the middle of the town, but it's still in the landscape. Thank you very much. We have so many interesting things here. And then we have maybe also talk about what is pure nature.
To critically evaluate our approach to adult education.
Yeah.
Very good.
You think about it.
I'll think about that.
Yeah. Very nice. Thank you very much. So many responses. So let's go into our first chapter and now leave the university. And we won't delve deep into science education because you are not necessarily science educators, but I think some phenomena are interesting anyway. So that's just our view from the university. As Cecilie showed you the picture in the night, and this is the other view to the point where the picture was taken. And here we see already, we don't see a glacier yet, but we see that the mountains around this island which we live on are quite high, about 1,300 meters to the top of the Tromsdalstinden here. But we at least see one or two of the typical things in Northern Norway, which Cecilie mentioned. We see large valleys, which most often are this U-shaped form. And this is, of course, the work of glaciers through 30 ice ages during the last 2.6 million years. They carved out this large valley in this way, as you can think about a huge ice block flowing slowly through the landscape and then carving it out. And if they do it so much that this is beneath sea level, then you get a fjord, which you see from the left to the right here, which is also a U valley, but it's so low that it's now filled with water. And that's mainly what it is in our landscape, a mixture of land and water. So it's like Ljubljana, but just water-filled, you could say. So that's the two typical large landscape forms we encounter. So if we just take a map and zoom a little bit more in than in the beginning, now we have Tromsø in the middle here. And we just looked at this little valley. And as you can see, of course, with our students, normally we go around on the island, around the island. Here we can see a lot of nice landscape forms shaped by the glaciers. But if we want to see the real glaciers, we have to drive not only half an hour, but into this, what is called the Lyngen Alps or Lyngen Peninsula. And here we see the white marked areas in the middle. There are the glaciers. So this is quite a different perspective than you have in the Alps. I think if you travel to Graz or to the Dachstein Glacier, which we had a good collaboration with Philip in Graz, there you just take a cable car onto the glacier. We won't be able to do this. We have to have a 2-hour drive. And that's maybe why Tromsø is so popular also, because our landscape is very vast without a lot of people living there. But here around Tromsø, we have several streets to reach these regions. So it's nice. I heard that there were some geographers who are surely happy into maps, but most people want to see how this really looks like. So let's just take a look on this peninsula from the north, where we have a better view. So that's how it looks like. You see more to the right, there was Tromsø somewhere there, and around Tromsø, many mountains are like a little slopey, soft hills nearly. But then you get this Lyngen Peninsula with these very large and very sharp mountains, which are more like the Alps and therefore called the Lyngen Alps. Very popular among all these enthusiasts that think they have to go on ski in every situation. So there are always some people dying nearly every year when they underestimate how dangerous nature actually is.
Could be.
Could be, yes. But it's also not only tourists, also people living in Tromsø who just think that, oh, we have to take this top as well. So, and the weather is good. So that's not always the case. So we have to drive there. And then I think we arrive at, now it went back. After 2 hours drive, we arrive at a parking lot below the glacier. And here I think our title actually was created because we thought, oh, nice. Now we are at the glacier, but what we see is only a forest. Nothing there yet to see of a glacier. So this is like the landscape in the inner part of Northern Norway looks like. Forests, sometimes spruce, sometimes pine, down at the sea level, but then we will see other forests when we follow the hiking path up to the glacier. So here's another map for you. We are now, I don't know if I can. Yeah, I think I can even draw a little bit. We are now at a parking lot at sea level here. Because all the streets go at sea level. It's so steep, the landscape here, that you don't have, you have no housings, no streets up the mountains. It's only small trails. So we will follow this trail up here, and we will stop on our way, and still no glacier to see. But when we come up in this main valley, like here's a little cabin. We can just get a coffee maybe if we cook it by ourselves. There won't be people there. Then we can follow it, and then maybe we are able to see the glacier, which is on the left side on the map here. And you see it's coming down from the even higher parts of the mountains. A glacier fall down into the valley, and we will see how this looks like in real pictures. So let's now of course everybody has to prepare themselves, rucksacks, everything is ready or not. So while we are waiting, let's just look around a little bit, and there we see the first thing I wanted to show you, because it looks quite different maybe from the typical stones that you have around Ljubljana or in the coast in the Mediterranean. There are some erratic rocks just lying around the parking lot, and normally you would just pass by, but maybe today we to take a closer look at these. And I just wonder again, with all your different backgrounds, so this is an open question which I also pose to my students normally, who have also different backgrounds when they get become a teacher for maybe the first 10 years in school. So just think about it a little bit. What do you think? What kind of rock could this be? Or even how would it come here? Because it's obviously loose rocks, not like bedrock, which is anchored in the ground. So who puts all these rocks here? Just your spontaneous ideas. What kind of rock could this be? If you like to. At least one participant has an idea. Now we'll see if you have creative ideas. Yeah, limestone. Yeah, it might look similar. I brought it down to the valley and moved it. Yeah, maybe a volcano. Yeah, moved down by the glacier. Magnetic or metamorphic. Granite. Cool. Many ideas. Very good. So most of you think aliens or even humans. Who knows? People, yeah, we are very fond of moving stones around and digging tunnels and so on and on.
And cairns. I guess you have seen the cairns. Varda, cairns.
Yeah, on the top of the mountain. Yeah, so many possibilities here. That's what we normally do in our outdoor education too. We normally don't give an answer about what people see. We normally ask them about what they think it is, to open up their minds and to see their background level. Most of you thought the glacier brought it there. So yeah, the rats from the Ice Age movies. That's a common thing that's especially the youngsters think about. Okay, glacier and ice is absolutely on the top. This might be a possibility, and rolling off even from the glacier or from the mountainside. Let's take a look at it. Thank you all. There was still someone typing. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but we have so many good possibilities. Let's take a look at the stone itself, because we can do two things if we walk through the landscape. We can see about the surface of the area, which is often shaped of the glaciers in the last time, and then we can look at the rocks itself and look at their structure and see what kind of rocks there are. And these are, of course, now we can see if we zoom in here, this looks not really like limestone, right? There's a very dark minerals mainly, and then you have this red minerals. They are now just cut in two, so they don't look so nice. But they are called garnet. They are actually developing if a rock is squeezed and a lot of pressure and it's warming up deep down in the earth crust. So this crystals here give us some clues that these rocks actually are not sedimentary like limestone or something, but these are actually what we call metamorphic, deformed old rocks which were squeezed, and we see this like a little bit in the structure here, this foliage pattern, like somebody just put a big weight on it and squeezed it so long that we have these linear structures in here. Not fully linear, but there has happened a lot to this stone, a metamorphic rock. And you can see this kind of layers all everywhere. So this again, if we go zoom out, it looks like maybe like limestone, but if we zoom in, we see that's a totally different thing. And so we can walk further on, and you see somebody thought it was maybe gneiss, and that is right. We have also this kind of stone here, again squeezed enormously several kilometers under the earth crust, some day or some years long before now. It actually was an event which is called the Caledonian Orogenesis, and in normal words you could say 400 million years ago, 500 to 400 million years ago, Greenland and Norway crashed, or the whole continents crushed together, and it was two continents colliding, taking everything in between us of an old sea which was there before, taking with it and just showing up a huge mountain range, which was like the Himalaya today, maybe even higher. So there was huge mountains before, and if we see this mountain today, it's only a little tiny rest of what once was there, because 400 million years is a 400 million years is a long time ago. Most of it is gone. It's only the base layer we see now. So now we see several rocks that were actually metamorphic down here. It's a complicated thing. So many sheets of surface which were squeezed to each other. So and we see more of this on our way. And then the other thing was what most of you thought, yeah, it was maybe a glacier who put these single rocks down there. This is, of course, a very good hypothesis, because we had these large ice sheets. This is the last one, 20,000 years before now. And when it melted, the glaciers, the glacier tongues and the ice rivers, so to say, they took with us a lot of stone material. In this case, at the parking lot, there was actually stones that are quite similar in the area. But when we move further up the hike and now come nearly to the main valley, we suddenly find even more of these rocks, a lot of them, like a huge rock fall. And there was, as somebody was suspecting, we had also volcanic activity, or volcanic rocks, or igneous rocks, or magmatic rocks, you may call them differently. And this is actually a case. These stones, if we look nearer to them, so this is a little picture here on the right, if we just open one of the stones and look into the inside, we see a totally other pattern inside. Crystals everywhere, white crystals, black crystals. This is typically actually a stone which once was created inside a volcano. It's called gabbro, this rock type. It had time to develop these crystals very hard, and this is not from where it's lying here and just making a big hinder in our way to the mountain, to the glacier, but it's actually somewhere has been fallen on a previous glacier, and then with the glacier, with the ice flow coming down the valley right here, deposited here. Because if you can see up the mountains now we have a freer view. If we're in the main valley, then you see up here, these mountains are so dark. These are actually rests of an old volcanic area, which was in the middle between, so to say, Greenland and Europe at that time. And then it was just squeezed inside this big mountain range. And today, in the end, we see this sticking up a lot more than the mountains around the other metamorphic rocks, because this one is much harder than the metamorphic which we met in the entrance at the parking lot. Yes, what do you want to think?
Where is the glacier?
Oh, it was still not there. No, right.
No, I just wanted to point out that we might say something about the tree line. So how high are we? Because the tree line here in the Arctic is very low. So it seems like we are in the high mountains, 1,000 meters.
Yeah, but we may be at around 200, 300 meters, not far,
Yeah.
much higher.
So we're still pretty low in the landscape.
We
here.
are, but the mountain itself up here will be above 1,000 meters. But that's right. That's another thing which is different than in the Alps. Yes, you were asking for the glacier. Yeah. Now we are coming in the main valley, and just take a look to the left. Oh, no, that was not the glacier again. Still not the glacier. But if you look at this river, which is making a lot of noise, which we would like to have an audio now, but unfortunately that was too complicated. But look at this river. Something special here. And that's what our students always think about. Oh, that's so cool. It looks like milk, bluish gray. Let's take a sip and look and think of it. Really tastes good. And we will always say, no, please don't. This is actually the water coming from the glacier. And what we see is this grayish blue color is very fine-grained silt or clay particles that the glacier took with itself, and now it's melting. When the melting water comes down, it takes with us all these fine sediments. The sediments themselves may not be harmful, but we don't know so much yet about the heavy metals in it. There's an own research project. What happens with the heavy metals load down in the glacier. And then there is also the all the bacteria and different microbes that might have been in the glacier, which we don't know about their pathogens. So don't drink such meltwater. But if you see, it's not only the river from the glacier, there are also normal rivers coming in here, meeting each other, and then when you see the difference between the normal river water and the river water from the glacier. We always stop at such a point where these different rivers meet, because it's so interesting to discuss with the students. Will there be any difference between those rivers? How could we find about it? Very easy is, of course, to think about maybe there's a different temperature, and especially if we go to glaciers, we have so many temperature difference that it's fun to just take off your shoes, walk into, see if there's a difference. And for those who don't dare, we have with us a thermal camera, an infrared camera. And then if you take pictures, then you suddenly see the landscape in a totally different way. And that's very interesting for students to just open their minds and think about. This is our human way of seeing a landscape. But if you're an insect, or if you're a snake or we don't have snakes here, but maybe in the Alps you have, then you actually have the possibility to see landscape in a whole other way than we are used to. And so we play a lot in all age classes with these infrared cameras, because you learn such a lot about your own body, or in this case about the nature around you. And you can measure temperature far away from where you stand, and that's also a very good advantage. So advise everybody who works in adult education, buy one of these cameras. They are not so expensive anymore, look like small mobile phones, or there are some even smaller ones which you just put in through the USB port into the mobile phone. You can do so much funny things about it. Even if it's a very foggy situation, you can see the people behind the fog with these cameras, because they're warmer. Or you find hidden owls or hidden other mammals hiding in the forest with these cameras. Or you might even search for your own students. So, but still, you were missing the glacier. Yeah, no, I think it's time to.
We've been
oh, look at it! There it is. Now we have the full view, or the nearly full view of the glacier, and you see
Still some hinders.
There are some hinders, yes. And these are typical hinders before glaciers. You see these ridges in the valley from the left to the right, in the totally opposite direction, 90 degrees angle to the glacier, which when it was larger, went through this valley, carving it out. But when the glacier is so small as now, it still works, it still flows down the valley, and it takes with it stones every year, rocks in all sizes, moving down. And if it happens to be at one point over a long time, then it actually builds up these huge ridges, which are called moraines or end moraines. And which you see here, you can also see these are different old moraines. This one is, of course, much older, fully with forest on it. Still, these other ones, these large ones, are quite new, it looks like. There's no vegetation on it. And these are actually from what we call the Little Ice Age. If you are into conspiracy theories and you were afraid of that we soon get into the next ice age, just think about it. From the up to the 1850s, we had this little ice age, some 5 degrees colder than, or 6 degrees colder than now. And there the glacier was suddenly becoming larger than it was before. It was totally gone, maybe even before. So there was a lot of material, and just put it down the valley and moved it and made these large heaps of raw material. So this is actually cool. We suppose it's from the glacier, but if we are honest, we have to do a little closer look at these ridges to be sure that it's from the glacier. That means we can just look down to it and see, okay, here are different boulders in different sizes. And if we are very thorough, then we take a sample, a soil sample, and have it through a set of sieves, and then we see we have all different sizes. This is typically glacier soil. The glacier doesn't discriminate. It is no racist. It takes with it everything it can on the ground from above, laying it down here. Now I talked a very lot, and I think it's time we go to the glacier and we see how these moraines are built, and maybe we could even go up to the glacier, because now we are there. Suddenly, after a at least 2 hour walk, we reach the glacier, and I think it's your turn, or you might even have a little break.
Yes, thank you, Jan. That was almost coming through the screen. And as a physical and outdoor education teacher, I know that sitting for long is not good for your body, it's not good for your brain, it's not good for your health. So let's just take 1 minute of finding your own posture until we go further. Just loose your body from the chair, just as you want. I will do it.
You will do it.
Not together. It's a voluntarily.
It's voluntary for everybody, but just stretch yourself.
I do this with students all the time. 1 minute we need.
Yes.
Oh, I love the happy baby one.
I could show you Cecilie on the floor down there, but she is really all in it. So, as a role model should be, very nice.
Yeah, thank you. I do this with my
I hope
students every day.
didn't sleep by now, so yeah.
Okay, good. You're back. So let's continue. We have now reached the glacier, and for the youngest, I guess it's been a long walk, so we might even had a night of sleep before we enter the glacier. But with the adults one, we can for sure start working on the next level. And I think when we talk about the glacier, we need different kinds of knowledge. So am I allowed to walk on the glacier? Of course, it's a natural question, and it's wild and free nature. So the answer, I guess, is yes. But
Yes,
but yeah, what about the skills? That's the first thing that people are wondering about. And every time I am at this glacier, I meet not a lot of tourists, but I meet some tourists without gear, and they always ask me if they can go on the glacier. Am I allowed to? Can I? Can you be responsible for my safety? And of course I cannot. And this is not a place where you can find huts and you have to order a guide in advance, or you have to be skilled enough to go there on your own, which is not so super complicated, but there's some things which is good to know. And then with my students, I really like the theoretical approach as well, like how we need to know something about the laws and the regulations, which is quite free in Norway. We can say that outdoor recreation is an important part of Norwegian cultural heritage and identity. Some people might be disagree with me that there's always a question of discussion. But I would say both the identity and the cultural heritage and the use of nature in different ways has been a quite large part of the Norwegian culture, as you might heard also in the first lecture, I guess, with your professor of geography, talked about identity in mountain regions, which I heard about. Very interesting. And for centuries, we have been free to roam the countryside in woodlands, in meadows, in rivers and lakes, amidst coastal islets and mountain summits, no matter who owns the land. And we do have something which I don't know if it's not maybe unique for Norway, but we have a pretty hard focus on this Norwegian right to roam the countryside, which is in Norwegian allemannsretten. I know that it's pretty famous in rest of Europe, and I know also with all the tourism and social media coming these days, there are people having own profiles where they'll highlight this right to roam in the countryside in a positive way. But there, of course, it also comes with a set of obligations. So it's a little right to roam. I would say it's very under deep pressure today, both politically and also the need for regulation, because we had this right to roam legally enshrined in the Outdoor Recreation Act of 1957. And a lot of things has changed in Norway since 1957 and in the world. So the right to roam comes, of course, with a set of obligations, but the society and the environment looks pretty different today, locally here and globally. So of course, whenever you exercise your right to access, you have obligated to do so with due care and consideration. But I think now when the need for regulation and the need for evaluating this right to roam, even in Norway, is very important, both when it comes to professionalism, democratization of nature, nature is no longer for experts, nature is for everyone uses it different ways. Also the rapidly increase, like I would say not rapidly, it's like an explosion of tourism. For example, the huge paradox that we are flying in tourists from all over the world to experience our nature all for free here in Norway. But at the same time, the backside is that we're spending so much money. We're like almost a bankrupt municipality. The municipality has very little money, but the region has very much of money. So we're spending quite a lot of money and energy trying to handle sustainable travel, both for people and for the community and for the ecosystems locally. So all these questions are very, very challenged these days. But at the same time, this is a luxury goal, I would say. The right to roam the countryside makes the nature not privatized, so it's accessible for us, and it's accessible for you too. So it has like this huge impact of how we are interacting with nature and how we are using the nature. So I would say the right to roam is a very underestimated. I've put down the link here in the side corner, so you can actually go, if you're interested, you can read the whole right to roam set here in English. It was translated in 2023 to English. So I think our future discussions in our community will for sure include the perspective more, both in education and politics. It's a really hot spot, and it's been doing a lot of research projects here in Tromsø about the pressure on the right to roam in the countryside. What's the next level? We don't know yet. Okay, let's move on. This is just a little...
This is not our glacier.
This is not our glacier. This is a different glacier. This is the only picture we brought from another glacier. Just we're going back to our... we're going back to our Steindale Glacier after a little while. But I just wanted to put in from this outdoor education perspective, the value me as a teacher find in multi-day excursions. And now we take a little jump in themes, but of course this is also, I would say, a thing which is under pressure, because when you work as a teacher wherever, there's a matter of resources and how much time you get and what's the curriculum says and how can you work. But I would say as an outdoor education teachers, we have highlighted for many, many years the value of multi-day excursions. And then we need to talk about hard skills or technical skills, maybe be a better word. It's not so gender loaded maybe. So, because if you separate between hard and soft skills, well, some have problematized it very much. So in the books now, you would maybe find more technical skills and interpersonal skills. And when I work with students, we always work with these three things, like what do you need to know as a teacher or a nature guide or a supervisor or an instructor or whatever you are going to work with. What kind of technical skills do you need? What kind of interpersonal skills do you need? And my experiences from everyday life is, of course, that we have time mostly to do day trips and to do outdoor education nearby our environment and our close environment. But once in a while in some programs, and Norway has a very good tradition of this multi-day excursion program. So in very many cities in Norway, we have programs in higher education and also in youth schools that will take pupils and students to multi-day excursions. This example is from a 10-day trip we did in Svalbard, Spitsbergen some years ago, where we are walking on glaciers for 6 days. So we are out together for 10 days as a big group. We sleep together, we cook together, we make decisions together. We are exploring glaciers together. We're working on safety, leadership skills. And this time we were fortunate, or maybe not fortunate, to have visitors in our food camp, as you can see on the picture on the right side. So that made us learn a lot more about decision making and being a teacher under pressure. So in this case, just to make the whole example, I know that a lot of you guys are teachers. In this case, we were 20 students and 4 teachers together for 10 days. And then the idea is that we walk. The goal is not to walk so far, but the goal is that how can we put as much as learning as we can, not between 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock, but we have learning situation 24/7. So we walk, we make plans for every day, and most of the days we are walking on a glacier, or in this huge picture here, we were coming down from the glacier from behind all the mountains that you can see, but there's a lot of crevasses on this glacier in the front. So the students you see in the front here, they are walking on the sea ice. They are not walking on the glacier. So this is like the huge glacier front. And the glacier front in Svalbard are lying, it's resting in the sea. Is that the correct way to say it? Almost like this, but this is resting. This is like not the sea lake. This is just a glacier lake, but this one is really a different size.
And you should maybe say Svalbard or Spitsbergen, if it's not familiar for everybody here.
True.
It's still Norway, but it's an island, a group of islands, like 1 flight hour. Is it 1 flight hour from Tromsø to the north?
Yeah.
So now we are really in the high Arctic. And that looks a little bit like Greenland, if you know the Greenland pictures from the news media.
True. It looks like a little Greenland, yeah.
Yeah, and luckily Spitsbergen is not so much in the mainstream media, because the whole focus is on Trump and Greenland. But but the people there are for the moment very scared as well, because if Trump is looking at Greenland, Putin is looking at Svalbard.
We already share this island with Russians. So some parts of this island, Svalbard, is a mining society with it's steered by the Russian consul, and also it's mostly Ukrainian workers actually there. So we've had until recently a very good cooperation with the Russian society in Svalbard. Right now, this cooperation is under pressure, so we don't know about the future.
At least.
Yeah. So of course, feel free to ask questions if you like. I thought I was just many of you would maybe recognize this use of technical skills, interpersonal skills, and meta skills. And I would just say, like, briefly, of course, as we teach the students, of course, we need technical skills to hike on the glacier, especially this one, which is winter hikes. You need different. So in technical skills, we would put like a lot of hours and days working on safety thinking. I would put environmental skills also in the technical skills, maybe nature knowledge, like all the things that Jan knows about the rocks. We need that also. We need the natural knowledge to be able to read the landscape when we are taking outdoor educators out here. So I really like with these multi-day excursions that we try to put together people from different fields. Like there's fantastic if I could have a geologist or a geographer which have also the skills for traveling outside, because then we can merge and we can have this really interesting because we do have lectures outside too. We move quite a lot, but we do have lectures in the mornings, we have lectures during the lunch, we have philosophy circles in the nights if the weather allows us to it. So that's why we always make like the camps very close to each other. In this case, we were many tents, but we have this huge circle every day, where we can meet and look in our eyes and talk together. And of course, the interpersonal skills, I would say, is much about the instructional and pedagogical and organizational way of doing things. We try always to not bring our students. We do it through supervising. So like, I guess you all are familiar with like maybe the facilitation skills we need. And then we have the meta skills that after 1 or 2 years, I would see that the students have quite a lot of improvement of how to problem solve. What if your group goes through the ice? How to do decision making? Rope or not rope on the glacier? What about your avalanche knowledge? What about the river crossing? What about the thickness of the ice, the difference of the sea ice or the freshwater ice, for example? What kind of knowledge do we need and how do we put it in the correct situation? So, and of course, a lot of this is experience-based judgment. We cannot read a book to cover all this. So we spend quite a lot of time, I would say, on reflections also when we are hiking on these tours. Like here, for example, when Kalle was, we had a big discussion about to continue our tour on the glacier or on the sea ice. What would be the safest thing to do for our group? So we had this almost half a day of reflection and discussion groups, small groups, larger groups, sitting groups, teacher voices, student voices, back and forth. And we did all of this decision-making, problem-solving now. So here is just a picture of measuring the sea ice close to the glacier and finding out what's accessible for us. Acceptable. I'm sorry. What's acceptable for us to continue traveling as a large group then. So on the left picture again, we are back on Steindalen. There was a little digression to Spitsbergen there. So because they have these beautiful glaciers, which are interesting to work on, but we can work on the same moments in Steindalen Glacier. So here we're just trying to figure out how many meters do we need? Are we walking in a rope or not? So the students are preparing for making a rope team. I put down a little words for you if you want to, but the discussion in Norway, the latest years of outdoor leadership has moved a lot from what kind of hard and technical skills do you need to be a good outdoor teacher, and nowadays it comes articles and it comes more research towards the importance of the relational competence in the guiding or in the teaching. How can the relational competence or the relational perspectives between humans and nature be there in a higher point for sustainable thinking in teaching? So what that's kind of under research, but what do we mean with relational competence, relation to the nature, relation to each other, meta skills in creating groups, in creating good learning climates? So the identifying what kind of knowledge and values and skills we need where to be a good outdoor teacher, that's kind of a lot of the work we spend time on with the students together with all the hard skills. That's after a while, it's just there in your body. We always try to be as much as possible outside, so you can like embodied, so you can internal this knowledge of just being outside, because then you can reach the next level of reflections. So I would say it's not a quick fix work to make people think sustainability. And I just go back a little bit because I found this very interesting part from the Green Competence framework. Like they write, when learners are encouraged to reflect and question knowledge acquisition, assimilate it and put it into practice, transformative learning takes place. And such learning involves cognitive, psychomotoric, and affective, like the heart, and encourage reflection, questioning, and action. So transformative learning is learned center, therefore promoting student agency. So I find those sentences very treffende.
Yeah.
What would you say? To the point of the aim of my approach. But then, okay, let's move a little forward. This is also a link. So just to put this in a little context, now we are on our glacier again. We're back home in Tromsø Glacier. We have put on some gear, and we have, now the deal is to walk on the glacier for fun. Yeah, we are not walking to the next village or across the mountains. We're just playing on the ice, and we're playing in the difficult landscape. We could maybe find an easier way, but this day we choose to try to walk the hard way across the crevasses. So as you can see, the crevasses are they're not too deep, but they're deep enough that we cannot cross them either as a road team or as a single person team. So this is a group, I would say, with not so much experience in glacier hikes, but they have maybe a lot of experience in being outside. So very outdoorsy students, but lack of skills in judgment and in roping and stuff. So here we are spending actually a whole day of trying to read the glacier, trying to figure out, go up one way. Sorry, it's wrong. We have to go down again. So it's a time consuming practice, but interesting to do.
Very interesting, by the way. We had a research project where we filmed with the 360 degrees cameras here on the glacier with the students, school students from like the 7th to 9th grade. And there we had some students who were really afraid of this glacier tour. And they afterwards used virtual reality goggles to just go on this trip again in a safe environment. And they got so fascinated afterwards, and they said, oh no, I could nearly not open my eyes when we were up there, but I was so afraid. And now I really understand. That was very cool that we mixed the indoor perspective and the outdoor perspective.
Yeah.
So just a little.
Yeah. So true. Yeah, let's
Yes.
read a little bit where to go further.
Maybe there are some questions now, because now we have talked about 1 hour, and we didn't follow the chat, but Ima was very active there, I guess. And if you have some questions, we could just take them now, and then we will descend from the glacier after a while, so that we really can.
Yeah, there is one question. There was a lot of like comments as well in the chat, so I will share this with you, so you will be able to see the activity also later on. But the question right now is from Nevenka. If I understand well, you imitate indigenous people lives. How do Sámi and other indigenous people see your activities?
That's a really advanced question, because the way, as if we take the Sámi way of life or the traditional cultures, it's, what would you say, quite the opposite. Often you don't go into nature to have fun. It's always an aspect of it has a meaning on it. For example, gathering food, plucking blueberries, or something which is meaningful for your life, and you don't do this quite for just having fun. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's a very touchy theme in the education right now, because I would say everyone is trying to not imitate the way the Sámi people were living, but at the same time we try to investigate what was the culture like before, because I would say the challenging part for me in this living in this Sámi area is how to understand and practice the Sámi traditions without imitating it, or without very good. There's been like a lot of critiques lately in Tromsø. This is a quite tense theme here, and there's been a lot of critiques to educators for not bringing Sámi people into the education, like trying to understand the Sámi or the indigenous perspectives with doing it or imitating it, or going to a level, or making a fire the wrong way, or going with the reindeers, blah blah blah. But that we have maybe traditionally have a lack of cooperation with the indigenous culture itself. I don't think it's a huge problem here in Norway, because here we are quite, I think other countries, maybe as United States and Australia, has different issues related to that.
I mean, we have the same problem as everywhere with indigenous cultures, that there was this colonization and suppression of both the language and the culture over a long time. But since several years, it has been not an optional, but a plight for us to integrate this in our optimally in our everyday teaching, Sámi perspective. But what in reality has happened is, of course, that all teachers use the Sámi National Day. What's the English name of it? At least we have the 6th of February as the Sámi Day, and there every school makes some typical, stereotypical activities of the Sámi that have reindeer. And then it just disappears again from the teaching. So we are in this dilemma and trying to navigate to integrate some Sámi perspective where it is seems useful as a normal way of life, of different types of life. For example, if we have about species knowledge, plant species knowledge, and then we just integrate it as a way like traditional knowledge, how very useful it is to actually find the plants, find the right plants, find the nutrition you need. For example, vitamins in the darkness here, you have to rely on traditional techniques to survive the winter. Otherwise, you will have, I don't know what Sherwood Scoville is in.
Yeah, scar.
Oh.
Yeah, the sickness you got when you lack your key vitamin.
Yeah,
Scurvy.
Yeah, scurvy, right. So there's a lot of very positive points which you can take up just to integrate it better in the normal daily life.
So thank you for that question. That was a really suitable question for this slide, actually, because we've also put a link to you guys through Emma about Norwayism, which I find really interesting. It was one of our professors in outdoor education in the south. He's not working here in the north, but he's a very large voice, I think, in the outdoor education field. And he recently published this essay in English and Norwegian about Norwayism, which is a very critical perspective on how he calls it a failed ideological framework for understanding and conceptualizing the Norwegian friluftsliv. And Norwegian friluftsliv would be directly translated to free air life or outdoor recreation, which has like all this outdoor education field in Norway has roots in the 60s. It has roots in the 60s and the eco-philosophers, which made it an academic discipline in 1968. So of course, I find it very, very relevant again today. I don't think the eco-philosophy stands very strong in Norway today. It's actually a much larger environment in the rest of Europe and in other countries, paradoxically enough, actually. So, but the eco-philosophers in Norway in the 60s, the goal with starting outdoor recreation studies and put it into the curriculum and into the politicians' regulations was, of course, to win new friends of the wild and free nature and to protect nature. So historically it had a very close link to the environmental movement and still has, but I think the eco-philosophy thinking has been under a lot of pressure and critics here. And that's why I think this Norwayism critical essay might be very interesting for you, especially when you hear about Norway and the romanticism and the myth of the friluftsliv, Scandinavian style of living outside, and that's why we are so healthy and all that mythical ways of So I think it's a very interesting, and he also highlights that we can only understand how people talk about outdoor activities in nature today by really examining how people talked about outdoor activities in the past. So this is a good perspective to bring on when we are rumbling around in our new gear outside, walking on glaciers, looking like $1 million Gore-Tex, blah, blah, blah. So we need this like value orientation of what we are doing, because if we are outdoor educators and still we're spending a lot of both, you of course know this dilemma.
Yeah, money and gear on plastics.
So I guess that the whole idea of that outdoor education makes people want to protect nature more is challenged very much here in Norway right now.
Should we mention the extreme example of we have very rich tourists coming in and just buying this outdoor gear for thousands of euros for one day out in the free, and then just leaving it in the hotels when they leave because they won't need it at home. Money doesn't matter.
And some students have make an advantage of that. So there's the student organization who actually take those clothes from the hotels and they make flea markets out of it. They sell the clothes further to the community and to other students. So something comes out of it.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's really,
We have also 2 more questions.
Yes.
I'll read them both and you decide how you answer. The first one is about who you are taking out on the expeditions. Are those all the students at your university, or some subject and some courses? So this is the first one. And the second, this was from Jana. And the second from Tanya was, do you have any specific methods to measure the effects of such learning? So to measure knowledge, skills, emotions, values, how they change. So those 2 questions are also in the chat. Yeah.
Very nice. We have 14 minutes to do this. We could, shall we just hop onto the research part? Because I actually in the last years had research on the beliefs of our student teachers, and we are mostly taking student teachers out. These are beliefs not often directly to the glacier, but I can help.
What?
Help. That was so. You see the pictures we wanted to show you. but it's not necessarily on the glacier. But I asked them to think about how they picture their science education before we begin the studies, to just make them aware of if they maybe have some stereotypes or so. And very often in these intuitive pictures, you see, as I have my students in science, so you have this typical, stereotypical science classroom, despite them having had a course in outdoor education before, but not necessarily science. And when we then, after 1 year of having both chemistry, physics, geology, and so on outdoors, we begin to see that these beliefs in their drawings, if they just picture how they see their own teaching afterwards, how this changes. This is one example where they are combining different learning arenas. Another example is going even further, and they are recognizing that first we would just focus on how, if we have science, we of course have this room, but then we know that if we have these small children outdoors, when you have them in friluftsliv, in the breaks and on the days where they go on a hike, then we are outside anyway. So maybe we could actually do this in different learning arenas, and these aspects of their beliefs that pop up both in reflective discussions and in their pictures. So these was just 3 examples of students. And then you see also a very interesting thing, and it is a general critique on especially science education, that you always teach these generic principles, facts. This is how it is, especially in physics and chemistry. But then you see they suddenly get this personalization, individual places that appear in their drawings. This is actually where we were, and there we made some experiments, and they were fully meaningful. You can see so much in this picture to the right. You see the students in the model activity where they model how this burning logs, they simply seem to disappear, and then we made the connection to climate change, to enhance the carbon dioxide levels and so on. So they just, every of these aspects, they're embodied now, as you said. This is all, this is both cognitive aspects, motor aspects, sensory, and the heart, yes. They suddenly pop out in their beliefs, and we hope that this leads to a more varied education, that, of course, in the end. So that was on the question if something happens and if how we measure it. So this is my latest research, where they measure the beliefs and drawing about them, because then they can express both things they have words for, and they can express things that they lack words of how to describe things. So that's very interesting. There's qualitative research, of course, not quantitative, but there's so much to get out of these drawings. I like especially this drawing. It's so fantastic. It's actually a drawing where I ask, how do you picture chemistry education after 1 year?
Comparing to the first
Comparing
one.
to the first one, yes.
And yeah, good. And the first question was about what kind of students we bring to expeditions.
Yeah, are those all the students, or
that's also a good question, because now it might look like we are bringing all our teacher students to Svalbard and to expeditions. That we of course do not. So these examples are from different kind of student groups. I would say that the pictures you saw from Svalbard, from Spitsbergen Island, the big glacier excursions, that is students that apply to become either outdoor educators or nature guides. So they are not in common teacher education. They are on the side. They have applied into a more like a sports science, outdoor education, nature guiding, supervising in the outdoors, and they are in this 1 year. That's actually an international course, so it's half of the students are Norwegian and half of them are from all countries, and they can stay in Svalbard for 1 whole year, and then they take, if they want to continue on the bachelor degree, they come to Tromsø and they take the next 2 years. And
Yeah,
some examples are from day trips. So I would say that we try to bring all our students out in the base courses, like the first year in the teacher education. We try to do something outside with everyone, but
yeah, I can show you just here. These are the normal student teachers which aim
teacher
at
students.
student teachers, whatever. There are, I think, different traditions. Pre-service teachers who aim at both elementary school and secondary schools. All of them are taken outside in the nearby environment and showing them how to both recognize phenomena, work with them actively. And these are, of course, as this was this project, both on winter and summer, are working with basic chemistry, with the snow around, and how to see different properties in different substances. So this is near the university. So that's just a 5-minute walk outdoors. So we are outside with them, but not at the glaciers with all of them.
In my courses, I try to have at least 1 day a week. So if we have lectures 20 weeks a year, then we try in those courses, or how do you say M&M?
Yeah, the course.
Yeah, it's a course. So 1 course could be 20 credits, for example. Then we try to stay outside at least 1 day a week, or we try to have some big variations. And we also try to encourage them to make projects together with the early childhood community or the preschool teachers, that they can go outside and do outdoor tests with the kids and then come back again to us, and then we try to explore it together. So I would say it's a big range of variation.
Emma, now you're muted.
Okay, do we have some more questions? You can also speak up if you want, or write it.
You can maybe show the last.
Ja,
Okay.
det bilder vi ville vise. Ska vi se.
Nobody dares.
Nobody.
It's the same if we have the large courses.
What are we missing?
I do have a question, and
Yes.
this journey to the glacier, right? The narrative you chose with, oh, we are not yet at the glacier, we are not at the glacier. It made me think about something, and it's about the role of patience and observation in outdoor learning. So, and taking the time. It's not something that you do, oh, let's go for an hour outside. So maybe if you can speak a bit more on that, on the role of this kind of soft skills, also as an educator, not just encouraging them in students, but you have to, I guess, have a certain outlook yourself.
Yeah, I love that question, and I think that's one of the hardest thing being in outdoor education in academia, because our practical frames hinders us very often to take our time. So I feel there's a disconnection between my values in being an outdoor teacher and what I am allowed to do, especially right now when I'm at teacher education. When I'm at the outdoor education and nature guide educations, we use all our resources to be outside. We barely have any lectures inside. We are outside for a week. We are outside all days. We meet at 8 o'clock. We have all the things that we could do inside, but we try to move them outside, even in the nearby area. We can go behind the next building to make a fire together, and we have a lunch there, and we try to stay there for hours, because then the students, in a way, in the beginning, they are longing for coming inside. They're like, they're underdressed because we're only staying outside for some hours. But then we sometimes I push it for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, because then we can come into this different mode of talking and reflection and doing stuff, and also adapting to that kind of situation and that kind of patience-ness. I think for me right now we are in this acceleration time, which really makes us try to slow things down in education as too. I think that the society and our culture is enhancing us to accelerate everything. So I think this has changed. For me, 10 years ago, it was different. I think now with all the use, I have to strive more with the students to put away their phone. Even in my outside lecture. Yesterday, I had a 2-hour ski tour from the campus with my students. The goal was to do play and to make a play area for 6-year-old kids. That was the goal for the day, 2-3 hours. Soft snow, sun, cross-country skis, play. And I had like 5 or 6 times I was like really working hard with them, because after 2 hours they're still in their mobile phone. They have so problems with being present. And so I see personally a very big difference of being outside for a long time. And we can have rules, and we can establish rules of how we are working outside, and we can do that early in the year, and we can make this kind of code of conduct in a way. I really like to have them for a year, so I can make this code of conduct. This is how we work outside. Yeah. Well.
Yes. You see there, I see there are a lot of questions, and we could talk hours on, I guess, about, because the dilemmas are there. I'm
just reading one more.
We have the last question. This is about the classical adult education. So, and then you are thinking on adults getting basic education, or how do you think? Who was it who asked this question?
Nevenka, I think. What did you have in mind?
Nevenka, yeah.
Non-formal. Okay. So yeah, the
non-formal.
How is it similar or different from the non-formal education offerings?
We have all kinds of non-formal education offers, and in my time as a museum educator, then we had quite similar things, like on open days, when instead of showing around in a gallery inside the museum, I often had like, let's find this who is able to bend a rock, like on the shoreline or something. So this is like an open lecture. But here again, to come back to the initial question, for me as a teacher educator, the dilemma is of course very like the same that we now encounter in this webinar. You are sitting in Slovenia. It would be so fun to just sit together with you in a physical meeting outside in Slovenia, and smelling the air. Everything around us is a bird song and so on, and all this is missing in this digital work. So we have actually changed in this partly in these blended learning environments, which we have about some groups, that we have outsourced nearly everything of lectures and so on into reading before and after a gathering with the few physical gatherings we have. And during these physical gatherings, we are nearly only outside to model all the activities which you can do with your students, and all the theoretical stuff is otherwise coming into the lectures digitally and the discussions.
Okay, thank you. I think, wow, we are so punctual today. We'll close. So thank you both, Jan and Cecilia, for this talk. It had everything. It had suspense, a lot of rocks, science, interesting examples, and we even had an Ice Age conspiracy theory in there.
Yes, that's good.
And thank you also,
we
everyone.
Can have a nice.
We have some nice pictures also to look at now for the closing time.
For the closing title, yes. That's the earliest flowers as soon as the snow is gone, attracting the first pollinators.
Perfect for springtime.